Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. It was supposed to be the start of our perfect life together. We had just gotten married. Our honeymoon was set to be a dream come true. The beach was serene, the sun was setting, and everything felt right. But then, as we settled into the hotel room that night, I noticed something strange. My husband's phone buzzed with a message, and I couldn't help but glance over. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize, but the message made my stomach drop. "Dad, I miss you." My heart skipped a beat. Dad. He had never mentioned having a child. He looked at me when I froze, eyes widening, but I couldn't speak. The room felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in. How could he keep something like this from me? We had just vowed to spend our lives together, yet here I was, questioning everything. This wasn't just a random message. It was a sign that my new life was built on secrets. What did this mean for us? I stared at the phone in disbelief, the words on the screen burning into my mind. "Dad, I miss you." It wasn't a typo. It wasn't a mistake. It was a child reaching out to my husband. I turned to face him, my mouth dry, trying to process what was happening. He met my gaze, but there was no reassurance, no comfort in his eyes. Instead, there was an uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch on forever. "What is this?" I asked, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to sound calm. He didn't immediately respond, his eyes darting around the room as though looking for an escape. The truth was right in front of us, but he refused to acknowledge it. "It's nothing," he said, almost too quickly, but I could hear the tension in his voice. I couldn't let it go. This wasn't nothing. This was everything. The perfect honeymoon, the life we'd just begun, it was all crashing down. How long had he been hiding this? Was this a part of him that I would never truly know? I felt the anger bubbling up inside me, a mix of betrayal and confusion. "Who is this child?" I demanded, my voice now sharp and full of frustration. He swallowed hard, his eyes flicking nervously as if trying to avoid my gaze. His silence only made the situation worse. The room felt colder as the seconds ticked by, and I wondered if he even had an answer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. It's complicated," he said, his words coming out haltingly, like he was unsure how much to reveal. "Complicated," I repeated, my voice rising, unable to mask the hurt that laced every word. "How could you not tell me about this before we got married?" I felt betrayed. How could he stand there, looking at me, knowing he was hiding something so important? My mind raced as I tried to piece together the fragments of information I had, but they didn't fit. My husband, the man I trusted with everything, had kept this from me, and I couldn't understand why. He shifted uncomfortably under my gaze, unable to meet my eyes as I waited for a real answer. I was numb, my heart pounding in my chest as I processed what was happening. "I didn't want to tell you like this," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was going to tell you, just not yet." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. He was going to tell me? When? After our marriage? After we'd committed to spending our lives together? It didn't make sense. I couldn't fathom why he would keep something so significant from me. "Why didn't you tell me before we got married?" I demanded, my voice trembling with emotion. His eyes flickered with regret, but he didn't answer immediately. I could see the hesitation in his face. He was hiding something, and I had a feeling I wasn't going to like it. "I was scared," he finally admitted, his words soft and almost pained. "But scared of what? Losing me? Losing everything we had built together?" I couldn't help but feel that whatever his reasons were, they didn't justify the betrayal I was feeling. "I need to know everything," I said, my voice firm despite the tears that threatened to spill. "Who is this child? Why didn't you tell me before we got married?" I needed the truth, no matter how painful it was. I wasn't sure if I could trust him anymore, but I knew I couldn't move forward without understanding what had been kept hidden. He hesitated for a long moment, staring at the floor like he was wrestling with his own guilt. When he finally looked up, his face was a mixture of sadness and regret. "His name is Liam," he said, the words sounding foreign in my ears. "He's my son, from a relationship before we met." My breath caught in my throat. A son. My husband had a child, and I had never known. It was a shock that I couldn't shake, and it only deepened the feeling of betrayal. "Why didn't you tell me about him?" I asked again, my voice cracking. "I didn't want to lose you," he admitted, his voice barely audible. But in trying to protect me, he had built a wall of lies that seemed impossible to tear down. The weight of his confession settled heavily on my shoulders. A child, his child, had been kept from me for so long, and now everything felt shattered. We had just started our lives together, but the foundation was cracked. How could you keep this from me? I asked, the words coming out more quietly now, as though I had lost all the energy to scream. I didn't know how to tell you, he replied, his voice breaking. I was afraid you wouldn't accept it, or worse, you'd leave me. I stared at him, disbelief flooding my thoughts. We had promised to share our lives, to be honest with each other, and yet here I was, learning the truth about a secret child that had been hidden for years. How long has he been in your life? I pressed, needing more answers. He hesitated again, a look of guilt clouding his face. Since he was born, but I didn't get to see him much. His mother and I. It was complicated. His eyes darted away from me, and I knew there was more to this story, but I wasn't sure if he would ever fully reveal it. The room seemed to shrink around us as I processed his words. I wanted to scream, to demand more answers, but I couldn't. I was too stunned. When were you going to tell me? I asked quietly, my voice barely a whisper. He ran his fingers through his hair, clearly frustrated with himself. I don't know. I thought I could just move on, leave the past behind me. But then we got serious, and I didn't know how to bring it up without ruining everything. It felt like a slap in the face. His entire life before me had been a secret. A child, a past, all hidden away. How was I supposed to trust him now? I needed more. I needed to understand everything. Is he still in your life? I asked, feeling like I was being swallowed by the silence that followed. He looked at me, his expression torn. Yes, but I don't see him much. His mother doesn't let me. His words were loaded with unspoken feelings, and I could tell there was more to the story, but would he ever tell me? Could I even trust what he said? I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process everything. My mind was spinning, thoughts colliding in every direction. He had a child, a son, that I didn't know about. And now, on our honeymoon, I was forced to confront the reality of this secret. The dream of our perfect marriage felt like it was unraveling before my eyes. I need to meet him, I said suddenly, without thinking. His face drained of color. What? No, you can't, he said quickly, his voice rising. Why not? I asked, feeling a surge of anger. You've hidden him from me for so long. I have a right to meet him. He took a deep breath, then sat beside me, clearly conflicted. It's complicated, okay? His mother doesn't want anyone involved. I've tried, but she doesn't let me see him as much as I want to. I didn't know whether to believe him. Every word he spoke only added more layers of uncertainty to the situation. The man I married, the man I thought I knew, had a child I didn't know existed, and now it felt like I was drowning in lies. We spent the next few days on the honeymoon in a kind of silence, the air thick with tension. Every glance, every word felt loaded with unspoken truths. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Who was Liam's mother? What kind of relationship had they had? And why hadn't he told me any of this before we got married? I felt betrayed, confused, and lost. I wanted to trust him, to believe that this was just a mistake, a misstep in his past. But I couldn't. The fact that he had hidden such a significant part of his life from me made everything feel like a lie. We need to talk, I said one night, sitting across from him at dinner. He looked up from his plate, his face weary. I know, he said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. But I don't know how to explain this. It's not easy. I crossed my arms, unable to hold back my frustration. I deserve the truth, I told him, my voice firm. If we're going to make this work, you need to be honest with me. No more secrets. He nodded slowly, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. Was I ever going to get the full story? The next morning, he sat me down and began to tell me more about Liam. I met his mother years ago, before we met. It wasn't a serious relationship, but things happened. I wasn't ready to be a father. His voice faltered, and I could see the weight of regret in his eyes. I wasn't a good person back then. I made mistakes. I wasn't there for him when I should have been. I listened, but it wasn't enough. There were still so many questions, so many things that didn't add up. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked, my voice soft but filled with pain. I didn't want to lose you, he repeated, his eyes pleading. I thought if I told you, you'd leave, that you wouldn't understand. His words cut through me. It wasn't just the fact that he had a child, it was the betrayal that came with it. If he had been upfront with me from the beginning, maybe things would be different. But now, I was left to wonder how much of our life together had been built on lies. The days after that conversation were a blur. I still couldn't shake the weight of his confession, and the more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Liam, his son, he had a child that I hadn't known about, and now, my entire view of our relationship was changing. I started to think about all the moments we had shared, our wedding, our plans for the future, and wondered how many of them were built on secrets. Was I the fool in this situation? I knew I needed answers, but I wasn't sure if I could trust him anymore. Every time he looked at me, I saw a man who had kept his past hidden from me. Are you going to see him? I asked one evening, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes flickered with uncertainty. I don't know, he said quietly. I don't want to hurt you, but I also want to be a father to him. His words stung. I wanted to believe him, but could I? How could I trust him when everything felt like a lie? The next few days were filled with silence and awkwardness. He tried to reassure me, telling me that he had only kept the secret to protect me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. How many other things had he hidden from me? How many other secrets did he have? I felt like I was unraveling. I needed to know more about Liam, about the relationship my husband had with his mother, and most importantly, why he had chosen not to tell me. I spent hours searching the internet, trying to find anything I could about the child who had been hidden from me. But there was nothing. No pictures, no mention of him anywhere. It was as though he didn't exist. And that made everything feel even worse. Was this just a part of his past that he had buried, or was there something more he wasn't telling me? One evening, I finally gathered the courage to confront him again. I need to know everything, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Who was Liam's mother? Why didn't you tell me about him? His face hardened, and for a moment, I feared he would shut down again. But then he exhaled, as if resigning himself to the truth. Her name is Rachel, he said slowly. We were together for a short time before I met you. It wasn't serious, but things happened. We weren't careful. He paused, as though weighing his words. When I found out she was pregnant, I wasn't ready to be a father. I wasn't the man I am now. I sat down, processing his words. It hurt to hear him admit that he had made mistakes, but I needed more. What happened between you two? I asked. He sighed, his face full of regret. Rachel was angry. She didn't want me involved, and I didn't push her. I was selfish. The truth stung, but I needed to know how deep this went. Was he still involved with Rachel? Was there more to this than he was admitting? Days turned into weeks, and the tension between us never eased. My mind was consumed with thoughts of Liam and the life my husband had kept hidden from me. I found myself questioning everything. Could I really move forward with a man who had kept such a huge part of his life a secret? Could I trust him when it felt like there was so much he wasn't telling me? I asked him about Rachel again, wanting to know if there were any unresolved feelings between them. There's nothing between us, he said firmly, though his voice lacked conviction. I haven't seen her in years. But something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. I couldn't help but wonder if he was telling the truth, or if there was more to their relationship that he wasn't ready to admit. I needed to know if I was truly the only woman in his life, or if I was just another chapter in his long list of secrets. I couldn't take it anymore. The uncertainty, the lies, the secrets, it was all too much. I had to know the truth about Liam, about Rachel, about everything. I sat down with my husband one night, determined to get to the bottom of it. I want to meet Rachel, I said, my voice firm. He stared at me, his face turning pale. What? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to know the truth, I replied. I need to meet her to understand what's really going on. I can't keep living in the dark. He looked like he was about to protest, but then he seemed to deflate, as though the fight had gone out of him. I'll arrange it, he said quietly, his voice resigned. I didn't know if I could trust him, but I knew I had to meet Rachel. Only then would I have the answers I so desperately needed. The day came when my husband finally arranged the meeting with Rachel. My heart pounded in my chest as we drove to the small cafe where they were supposed to meet. I was a bundle of nerves, unsure of what I would find. Would Rachel be kind and understanding, or would she be confrontational and defensive? And what about my husband? Would he act differently around her? As we pulled into the parking lot, I felt a wave of uncertainty wash over me. This was the moment that could either heal the wounds or tear everything apart. We walked into the cafe together, and there she was, Rachel. She was sitting at a corner table, looking up as we approached. She was older than I had imagined, but there was a striking resemblance between her and Liam. I tried not to stare, but I couldn't help it. This woman had been a part of my husband's past, and now she was a part of my present. My heart raced as we sat down, and for the first time, I realized just how deep this secret ran. Rachel was surprisingly calm, though her eyes gave away a hint of tension. She offered a small smile as we exchanged pleasantries, but I could sense the unease in her voice. "I didn't know what you expected," she said softly, looking at my husband. "But I'm not here to cause trouble." Her words were measured, but I could see the underlying bitterness in her gaze. My husband, on the other hand, seemed unusually quiet, almost like he was retreating into himself. I wondered if this was the moment he had feared, the moment when his past would come face to face with his present. I couldn't help but ask, "Why didn't you tell me about Liam before? Why keep this from me?" Rachel looked at me for a long moment, her eyes hardening as she spoke. "It wasn't my decision to keep him from you," she said. "But he had his reasons. He wasn't ready to be a father, and I wasn't going to force him." My husband shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but didn't say anything. It was clear that the past was still weighing heavily on him. The conversation continued, each word hanging in the air like an unsolved mystery. I was desperate to understand what had happened, why things had turned out the way they did. But every time I asked a question, Rachel gave me vague answers. "It wasn't always easy," she said. "Liam is a good kid, but things between us didn't work out. It was complicated, but it wasn't enough. I needed to know more. Was there ever anything between you two after Liam was born?" I pressed, my voice barely concealing the frustration that had built up inside me. She hesitated for a moment before shaking her head. "No," she replied. "It ended before he was born." My husband was quiet throughout, avoiding my gaze, and I could see the guilt in his eyes. Was that the truth? Or was there something more? I wanted to believe Rachel, but something about her words didn't sit right with me. I needed more than just half-truths and silence. I needed closure, and this meeting wasn't giving me the answers I was looking for. After a long, uncomfortable silence, we finished our coffee and left the cafe. The air between us was thick with unresolved tension. I couldn't stop replaying Rachel's words in my head, trying to make sense of it all. Was my husband telling me the whole truth? Why had he kept his son from me for so long? I knew he had made mistakes in his past, but this felt like something deeper, something I couldn't ignore. As we walked to the car, I looked at him, my eyes searching his face for any sign of honesty. "Do you love me?" I asked suddenly, the question slipping out before I could stop it. He looked at me, startled by the bluntness of my words. "Of course I do," he replied, his voice soft, but there was hesitation in his eyes. "But the past, it's complicated, okay?" I nodded, but his words didn't reassure me. How could I trust him when it felt like there were still so many unanswered questions? Could I move forward, or was our marriage built on lies? We spent the next few days in a quiet tension, the silence between us growing heavier with each passing hour. I couldn't stop thinking about the meeting with Rachel, about the way my husband had acted, about the secrets he had kept. Every time I looked at him, I saw the man I had married, but there was a part of him that felt like a stranger. I began to wonder if I could ever truly trust him again. Could I accept Liam as part of our life, knowing the way he had been kept from me? Could I accept the fact that my husband's past was still so alive in his present? I tried to push those thoughts aside, but they kept creeping back into my mind. One night, as we sat together in silence, I turned to him and said, "I need more time to think about all of this." He nodded, understanding the weight of my words. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for everything. I just want to fix this, if you'll let me." But I wasn't sure if I could. The truth was, I wasn't sure what was broken anymore, or if it could ever be fixed. The days that followed were filled with so many questions, none of which seemed to have answers. I felt like I was losing myself, caught between the love I had for my husband and the betrayal I felt from his secrets. I couldn't shake the feeling that our marriage had been built on shaky ground. What else had he hidden from me? I found myself thinking about Liam constantly, wondering what he was like, who he looked like, and if he would ever become a part of my life. My husband seemed distant, lost in his own thoughts, but I couldn't blame him. The weight of his past had caught up with him, and now it was threatening to destroy everything we had built. I spent hours alone, reflecting on my life, trying to decide what I truly wanted. Was I strong enough to face this truth, or was I too scared to accept the man my husband truly was? One evening, my husband came to me with a proposal. "I think it's time we meet, Liam," he said quietly. His words were hesitant, but there was a sense of finality in his voice. We can't keep avoiding this forever. I know you're struggling with all of this, and I think seeing him might help you understand. My heart raced at the thought. Meeting Liam? Was I ready for that? Would it make things worse or help me find some closure? I nodded, though uncertainty still lingered in my mind. When? I asked. He looked at me, searching my face for any sign of hesitation. Tomorrow, he replied softly. I was shocked by how quickly things were moving, but deep down, I knew he was right. We couldn't keep hiding from the truth. I had to meet him, even if it meant facing the most painful truth of all. The next day, I found myself standing in front of a modest house, my heart pounding in my chest. My husband squeezed my hand, his touch offering me some comfort, though it did little to calm my nerves. We had arrived at Liam's home, and everything felt surreal. I had imagined this moment in my head 1,000 times, but now that it was real, I didn't know what to expect. Would Liam be angry with me for intruding in his life? Would I be able to connect with him, or would he always remain a stranger to me? My husband knocked on the door, and when it opened, I was faced with a young boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, his eyes wide with curiosity. He was the spitting image of my husband at that age, and in that moment, my world seemed to shift. This was Liam. He was real, and he was now a part of our lives, whether I was ready or not. The first few moments were awkward. My husband introduced me to Liam, and the boy shyly greeted me, his eyes full of uncertainty. I tried to smile, but it felt forced. How could I be the woman to welcome him into my life? I had so many emotions swirling inside me, from confusion to anger to sadness. This child had been kept from me for so long, and now I was supposed to accept him as part of our family? We sat down in the living room, and Liam's mother, Rachel, joined us. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was she judging me? Was she resentful of me for being a part of this family? I couldn't tell. My husband tried to make small talk, but I could hardly focus on his words. All I could think about was the fact that Liam was here, and that my life had just been turned upside down once again. As the conversation dragged on, I found myself growing more and more restless. The tension in the room was palpable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding on something that didn't belong to me. My mind kept racing with questions, but I didn't know how to ask them. How did Liam feel about me? Did he even understand the situation? My husband kept glancing at me, as though searching for reassurance, but I couldn't give it to him. I was drowning in my own confusion, unable to process the whirlwind of emotions that had taken over my life. I wanted to walk away from it all, to run far from the chaos, but I knew I couldn't. This was my reality now, and I had to face it head on. I wasn't sure if I could ever accept it, but I had no choice. My husband's past had come crashing into our present, and now it was up to me to decide what to do with it. As the afternoon wore on, Liam seemed to grow more comfortable around me, but the unease in my chest never fully went away. I watched him interact with my husband, and it was hard not to see the bond they shared. It was something raw, something real. I tried to push away the jealousy that simmered inside me, but it was impossible. How could I compete with a child from my husband's past? How could I not feel betrayed, knowing that Liam had existed all this time without my knowledge? The truth hit me like a brick wall. Liam was my husband's son, and he would always be a part of our lives, no matter how much I wanted to deny it. The question was no longer whether I could accept him, it was whether I could accept the life I was now living. The life where secrets and lies were woven into the fabric of our marriage. After we left Liam's house, my husband and I were silent in the car. I couldn't bring myself to speak, too overwhelmed by the weight of what had just transpired. The image of Liam kept flashing in my mind, his shy smile, his innocent eyes. He didn't deserve any of this. None of it was his fault, and yet, here I was, struggling to understand my place in all of this. I turned to my husband, finally breaking the silence. How long did you plan to keep this a secret? I asked, my voice trembling with emotion. He sighed, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I never planned for it to go this far, he said softly. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could keep it from you. But it wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't fair to Liam. I should have told you sooner. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much his lies had hurt me, but instead, I just nodded. Words seemed pointless now. The damage had already been done. The days following our visit to Liam's house were filled with tension. Every conversation with my husband felt strained, and the distance between us seemed to grow wider. I tried to act like everything was fine, but it was impossible to ignore the fact that things would never be the same. My husband had a son, and that meant a part of him belonged to someone else. It was hard to accept, but I had no choice. I had to find a way to move forward, even if I didn't know how. One night, as I sat alone in our living room, I began to wonder what my life would look like now. Would Liam become a permanent part of our family? Would I ever be able to fully embrace him? I wasn't sure. But the thought of losing my husband to his past scared me more than I cared to admit. I couldn't let go of him, even if it meant accepting the child I had never known existed. I found myself reaching out to Rachel more often, in an attempt to understand the situation better. Despite my initial discomfort, I realized she was a source of information about Liam's life before I came into the picture. She was his mother, after all. One afternoon, she invited me over for tea. When I arrived, she looked at me with a soft smile, but I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "I know this is hard for you," she said gently, "but Liam needs you to be a part of his life. He's already confused by everything, and it's only going to get harder for him the longer you avoid him." I felt a pang of guilt as her words hit me. I had been running away from the truth, from the reality that my husband's past was now my present. I had to stop hiding from it. I couldn't keep pretending that this wasn't my life now. Liam was my husband's son, and he was going to be a part of my life whether I was ready or not. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The turning point came one evening when my husband and I sat down to talk. "I know this hasn't been easy for you," he said softly, his eyes searching mine for some sign of understanding. "But I want you to know that I'm here. I'm committed to you, and I'm committed to Liam. We can make this work, together." I didn't respond immediately. My mind was racing with conflicting emotions: love for him, fear of the unknown, anger at the lies he had told. But as I looked into his eyes, I realized something. No matter how difficult this journey would be, we were in it together. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be bumps along the way, and I wasn't sure what the future held. But one thing was clear. I couldn't give up on us, on the life we had built. I had to face the truth, to accept Liam as a part of our world. And maybe, just maybe, I could learn to love him as my own. Thank you for listening to my story until now. If you liked the video, please support it by subscribing and liking.